So here we are today at the Secrets of Radar Museum in London, Ontario.
Okay, see you later, Steve. I'm actually in tomorrow for the EMS week thing.
Oh, okay, I won't be.
Nope, I understand.
I hope you enjoy.
Thanks later.
Yeah. You interested in a tour, or you just want to walk around on your own? That's fine too.
Yeah, I guess we could have a tour.
All right.
Yeah.
Can we video? I think he wants to.
Yeah, can we video? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Welcome to the Secrets of Radar Museum. I'm Steve Bordeaux. We were founded by a group of World War II radar veterans, and that was in 2003 when they opened this museum. The reason for that length of time was that when they went into the service in 1941, they were sworn to secrecy, and that wasn't lifted until 1991. So they had to keep a secret of what they did during the war for 50 years. So a lot of them would just say, well, I fixed radios. But they were actually in the top secret radar program.
Yeah.
So what started it all was in late 1934, the likelihood of war was looming over Britain, and the Air Ministry established the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, which sought the latest scientific methods of detecting hostile aircraft. They contacted Robert Watson Watt and his associate Arnold Wilkins and posed the question to them that they wanted them to investigate rumors of a German radio-powered death ray. This was a device they thought that the Germans had. They could point at an aircraft and kill the aircrew with high-energy radio waves. The first calculations showed that the amount of power required just to make the crew uncomfortable was enormous. So it was next to impossible to generate. So that wasn't really a feasibility. However, they did determine that they could bounce a radio wave off of an aircraft and receive the signal back. And by so doing, you can measure things like velocity, distance, that sort of thing. So, on February 26, 1935, Watson Watt, Wilkins, and a small team, accompanied by A.P. Rowe of the Air Ministry, ran the detection equipment from the back of a van, and a Hadley Page Hayford bomber flew along a predetermined path between their receiver and the BBC shortwave transmitting towers near Daventry. The test was a huge success. The aircraft was detected several times at a distance of about 13 kilometers. So the Air Ministry gave the immediate authorization to build a full demonstration system, and that's when British radar was born. So in late 1935, Germany was rapidly expanding its military. It became evident this new technology would be essential for Britain's survival in event of a war. So by 1937, that's only 2 years, Britain was developing its chain of home network radar stations along its east coast, looking out towards Europe. So we're going over here next. So, political tensions in Europe rose. The race towards developing a functional radar detection network around the British coast went into high gear. While the first radar station went into service in 1935, it would take until 1940 to set up a chain of systems sufficiently capable of protecting the coast. So by the end of war, they had gone all the way around Britain with radar stations. Once war broke out, it became even more important to outfit aircraft with airborne radar systems, since the Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF by a significant amount. Even the loss of a small number of aircraft would have been catastrophic. So allowing aircraft to remain functional in the dark of night would be essential. And unfortunately, became difficult for the RAF to find enough people to man all the necessary posts. You needed people with electronic knowledge. So, on October 14th, 1940, High Commissioner Sir Gerald Campbell of the UK made a request to the Canadian government to provide 1,000 men to assist in the war effort. So by October 10th, the RCAF had begun a tremendous effort to recruit volunteers. The first group of Canadians to be trained on radar were limited to those with a pre-existing knowledge of radio and electronics theory. Many came from a ham radio background. Their licenses had been canceled for security purposes at the outbreak of the war. And the Air Force made use of this list of amateur radio licensees and approached many of these frustrated radio hams to enlist. So as a result, nearly 100 of the original group of RCAF radar recruits came directly from an amateur radio background. These enlistees were drawn from the rest were drawn from a variety of radio and electronics backgrounds. In total, we had 61 officers and 794 radar mechanics who would enlist to be shipped off for specialized high-secret training in Great Britain. Many were trained at RAF Yatesbury, Presswork, and Cranwell, depending on the type of radar you're going to work on. Because now at this time, we had different kinds of radar. They were given RAF pay books and treated as if they were members of the RAF. However, they were generally eligible for promotions and pay increases. So this treatment would eventually get back to Canada, and it created a scandal in the Canadian Parliament. One of the tip-offs that they weren't being treated equally was they went over on the SS Leopoldville. And that was, I believe, a Belgian ship, and it was commandeered as a troop ship. It normally sailed the waters around the west coast of Africa, so didn't need a heating system, didn't have one. So these poor guys go over in the middle of January on this unheated boat in the North Atlantic. It was a brutal trip, and one veteran recalls he was one of the lucky ones because he was so violently seasick. He spent the whole trip in the infirmary, and that was the only place that had any heat. It was next to the boiler. Radar progressed at a furious pace. It became obvious there was a limited number of people with the right backgrounds to be given radar training. Most available had already been scooped up in the first round. So, Britain, as a result, the British Air Ministry urgently requested Canada to assist in implementing a Canadian-based radar training program. So beginning in June of 41, another 5,000 recruits would be given 3-month crash courses in radio and electronics theory across 13 universities in Canada. Those who passed this program were then sent to an Air Force base located at Clinton, Ontario for specialized training on radar. So 5 of these universities were located in Ontario, and among them was University of Western Ontario. So October 13th, 1941, instruction of 120 airmen got underway at Western. These students learned the basic principles of electric theory, radio physics, electronics, and the layout and construction of simple standard test equipment, radio transmitters, and receivers. Training programs were the same at each university, all with the aim of sending graduates to Clinton, known to some as slide rule squadrons. Do you know what a slide rule is?
No.
No.
It's the pre-electronic calculator. You have a series of sliding scales that you use to perform mathematical calculations.
But it's not abacus.
No, it's not an abacus. No. With a failure rate of up to 40%, trainees who failed could be sent to whatever area of service the RCAF dictated. No, son, you're still in the Air Force. We're going to find something for you to do. You could be, and it was from the cookhouse to cleaning latrines. You could have been doing anything, driving a truck. In late 42, the Air Ministry again requested more technicians over and above the contract for 5,000. This was rejected by a Ministry of National Defense, reflecting a widely held and probably justifiable feeling that Canadian radar personnel were not being treated fairly by the RAF. A total of 5 3-month courses had been completed at most universities, with about 7,500 recruits enrolled and about 4,500 graduating. Canada continued to train radar mechanics and operators, and Clinton expanded throughout the war. Thousands more Canadian radar recruits receiving training for work at home and internationally. It is estimated Canadians accounted for 35 to 50% of all Allied forces working in radar during World War II. Not bad for a little country.
Yeah.
So, North America's very first radar training program was located in just south of Clinton, Ontario on Highway 4. It's the village of Anastra. You still see the remnants of the base, which began its life in summer of 41 as Royal Air Force Radio Training School number 31. It finally closed its doors in 1971 as Canadian Forces Base Clinton. During its 30-year period, although operated mainly by the RAF, Clinton Base would train personnel from all military divisions from United States and further afield on state-of-the-art, top-secret radar equipment and operations. Wasn't all fun and games. Imagine you're stationed in a base in the middle of southwestern Ontario's farm country. If you could have got off base, you could have walked across the highway and picked sweet corn out of the farmer's field. But you are eating an unchanging diet of poorly prepared Royal Air Force regulation meals consisting of dehydrated potatoes, powdered eggs, canned milk, preserved meats, and condensed milk. And in the spring of 42, the trainee station at Clinton had had enough. And protests broke out over the terrible food provided by the RAF Run Kitchen. Veterans recall food fights, refusing to attend classes and carry out additional duties. Faced with a serious problem, the protests continued. On May 13th, the RAF turned the Airmen's Mess over to the RCAF Catering Division, and the transfer of food services to the RCAF foreshadowed what was to come in 1943, and that was when we took the base over for our own Canadian base program. So, on May 19th, the site was purchased from local farmer Norm Tyndall. Construction was underway. Only the silo of the original farm, which was adapted in Wagard Tower, survived the construction. It was nicknamed Cox Folly by Clinton personnel after the first commanding officer, Adrian Cox. The first trainees arrived at the train station in Clinton on August 14th, 1941. And two things interesting about that was, number one, the recruits were not Canadians, they were Americans.
Yeah.
Number two, America wasn't in the war yet. So everybody's going, that's interesting. Well, something had happened in 1940. During the Battle of Britain, the Brits decided their salvation would be to share their secrets with their allies in the hope that we can develop them. So they had just developed a prototype of a brand new vacuum tube called a cavity magnetron. And this device worked different than the devices of the day, and it allowed them to generate RF energy in the microwave frequency range. This allowed them to miniaturize the system and fit it into aircraft. So that was a game changer. So the Tizard mission brought it to Canada. National Research Council looked at it and said, this is amazing, this solves the problem, because everyone was stuck because they're using the conventional vacuum tubes. They couldn't get into the higher frequencies with them. So this would allow them to do it. So Canada adopted it. They took it to MIT in the States, and they had the same problem, so they jumped all over it. So now you get Canada and the United States designing and building radar systems around this new technology. So, of course, you have to train your repair guys, so that's why the Americans were here. We train people from the Marine Corps, Army, Navy, and they would take their knowledge, go back to the States and set up their own training schools. So the first Canadians arrived in mid-September of 1941, referred to themselves as Can 1. The first class of RCAF trainees found themselves in a hive of activity with rigorous training and classroom schedules maintained under the strictest security. Some describe it as Stalag-like after the German prison camps. Top secret clearance was strictly enforced and the base was surrounded by a flood-lit electrified barbed wire fence. All notes and workbooks were held in the training compound. Students who wished to study outside classroom hours had to return to the secure compound. Any training documents required at another base were transmitted by secure courier service. That said, there was evidently some security breaches as a number of veterans have donated their original notes to us. And they did it in good faith. Going, well, you know, I'm going overseas and I forget this stuff, I'm sunk. So they would take their notes and roll them up and hide it in their kit and take it overseas with them. Well, they could have been court-martialed for that. And we had a fellow bring in a map, and it's stamped top secret, and it's of Normandy. And this was their operations map. He says, yeah, we went in on D-Day +6 to set up navigation beacons and a portable radar, and this is the map they gave us for the locations. Well, why do you still have it? And his answer was, no one asked for it back. I couldn't leave it somewhere. So he took it home. Been there for 50 years. So, October 4th, the first American trainees had graduated, and after that time, most of the trainees were Canadians. But there was also an international contingent of Americans and other Commonwealth countries, including Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. So if you take off South Africa and add Canada to that list, that's the Five Eyes intelligence group we have today.
Oh, yeah.
So started back Second World War. So April 1943, Wing Commander Adrian Cox turned command over to Wing Commander J.C. Martin. Uniform rules relaxed in May, allowing the wearing of tropical summer kit, except on parade, which is nice because it was a wool tunic. The August 43, 2 years after opening its doors, the RAF formally turned the school over to RCF control as Canada moved its focus away from assisting British radar program towards developing our own. Wing Commander Ken R. Patrick became the first Canadian commanding officer of the newly redesignated No. 5 radio school. He held that post until the end of the war. March of 44, Women's Division RCAF officers and airwomen arrived for training. Following the end of the war in the Pacific in August of 45, the secret of radar's existence was unveiled to the Canadian public with a description of the technology and Clinton School secret function. By war's end, 2,345 Americans and 6,500 Canadians had graduated from Clinton, as well as much smaller numbers of other Allied personnel. And we continued training people right through to 1971. Another interesting London connection is H.B. Beale Secondary School. During the Second World War, most of the Ontario vocational schools were turned over to the Department of National Defence, and they ran classes 24 hours, 7 days a week to train people to go into factories to build the munitions. I love this picture. This is a metal turning lathe. All right, they're learning how to turn metal, and nobody's wearing safety glasses. You would be shut down today by the Ministry of Labor.
Yeah.
And all their women.
Yes.
Picture.
The men were at war. All the women were in the factories. That's the way it was back then. And that actually was probably the basis for the women's liberation movement, because Rosie the Riveter got told, well, you can go home home to the kitchen now because Bob's back and this was his job. That did not go over well. No, this is my job. I'm a welder. Yeah, and a lot of that. Thankfully, we've rated a lot of that. These are some of our Clinton artifacts themselves from the base. They had a monthly publication, Clinton Mercury. This is Ken Patrick's uniform, his decorations. And that's a picture of Ken. He's standing up, the guy with the mustache. And these two guys with the chef hats, guy on the left is Ken Patrick, guy on the right is Sir Robert Watson Watt. He was the father of radar, and that was taken at Western after the war, having a cookout at Western, and the backstory was Watson Watt's late, so he's speeding down the highway to get to London, and he gets pulled over by a brand new OPP radar van. When the cop tells him how he tracked him, his wife leans over and says, well, you know he invented radar. He still got the ticket. As he's driving away, he was muttering, if I knew they were going to use it for this, I'd have never invented it. So, now, get a little bit technical here because it shows how radar advanced throughout the war. The original radars were very primitive. They consisted of 350-foot transmitting towers, 240-foot receiving towers. These things did not rotate. You had to directionally move it electronically. And they could detect, they operated on a 12-meter wavelength, and they could detect aircraft up to 80 miles away. Basically, they could detect there was something coming from that direction. They couldn't tell you what altitude it was at, and they couldn't tell you what it was. So they would phone out to the coast, to the observers, tell them, we have something we're tracking on this compass bearing, please identify. So as soon as they saw it, they would call in with how many aircraft and what kind they were. So all that information went into a central processing room. So 12 meters, that's in the ham radio band frequency range. That's low frequency. So the first couple went into operation. There were problems with them. By the time the war began in 1939, scientists had recognized additional serious limitations, radio waves echoing off surrounding hills, equipment required regular recalibrations, they drifted in frequency. There was no way to determine if the detected aircraft was friendly, and most importantly, the system couldn't detect aircraft flying below an altitude of about 900 meters. Hence the term flying under the radar.
Flying under the radar.
A system called chain home low was developed to compensate for the low altitude gap, and another system, identification friend or foe, helped determine whether aircraft were friendly. And what the IFF would do is it was a transmitter in the aircraft that would transmit a signal on the radar frequency, and that would make their target look differently on the radar screen. So now you have a clear indication on the screen of who's friendly and who is not. Very helpful.
That's true.
We still don't have any height finding capability. So chain home low comes along. Oh, it's 1.5 meters now. So we've gone way up in frequency. So the shorter your wavelength, the higher your frequency. And that's about the limit for the conventional vacuum tubes. Frequency rise. That's it. And that's still in the ham radio bands. Now, this antenna was smaller, but it was still a large apparatus, and it was required to rotate it. So that was either by hand or by someone on a stationary bicycle hooked up to a gearbox. Remember, no son, you're not calling home. You're on the bike.
I'm going to be on the bike today.
Yes. So by February 1940, the first 11 CHL stations went up along the coast, they become a key surveillance system not only for detecting aircraft, but for ships and surfaced U-boats in the English Channel. Would be adapted in a mobile setups as a key component in ground control intercept radar. So, ground control intercept radar, basically now we've added height finding capability. Okay, so now we know what direction it's coming from, how high it is. IFF says it's friendly or not. Great, we got a lot of things going here. So, when an intruder was detected, a waiting night fighter was dispatched from a sector airfield. They called it scrambling. The ground control officer, who may well have been a pilot himself, had direct voice contact with the night fighter. So that's huge. Okay, he's talking directly to the fighter. A dedicated display console screen allowed the officer to see both aircraft positions simultaneously. The officer would guide the pilot using specific headings, heights, speeds to steer the fighter to the target so the fighter could make a final approach from behind and below the target. And most of these raids took place at night. So once close enough to the fighter picked up the intruder on his own airborne radar, and the pilot would often notify a ground control officer by shouting "tally ho" before he'd close in for the attack. So it was vitally important they kept the fact that they had radar in their aircraft secret. Air interception. So I will tell you this much. This is an IFF unit here. Doesn't look like much, but it would broadcast on an open frequency. Okay? Well, at one point, they could not figure out how the Germans were detecting the Allied bombers well before their radar was capable. Well, turned out the Germans had found the IFF frequency and they were using it to home in on the aircraft and vector their fighters. So, new rule, on your way into the target, you shut it off. On your way home, you turn it on so we know who's coming home. So, radar equipment installed in night fighter aircraft play an integral role in interception and destruction of enemy aircraft during the Second World War. Night fighters were used in all theaters of war where the threat of an enemy airborne attack was prevalent. Using conjunction with identification friend or foe, the ground control intercept over the course of the war would become an indispensable tool. Yep. Mark IV, fielded in Beaufighters, proved to be very effective in winning the night war over Britain in 41 and 42. Over the course of the war, Beaufighters carrying Mark IV would have many success stories, many theaters of operation. The invention of the cavity magnetron led to much more precise and smaller versions of AI radar. By mid-42, Beaufighters were fitted with Mark VIII, which is now a 9.1 centimeter. So this is a cavity magnetron here. Very high frequency. That's around 3 gigahertz. AI radar with a peak power of 25,000 watts. So the first magnetron was 7,000. Now we've got it up to 25,000. And we're using a single dish to transmit and receive the signal. So now you've got these sharp, focused, more powerful radar beams going out in front of the plane. So that means the radar can detect smaller objects farther away because you're getting a good, clean return signal. Then the Americans came out the following year with a Mark X operating on the same frequency as the Mark VIII with a much higher output of 70,000 watts. So the detect and destroy radar system used in night fighters was a major contributor to the final Allied victory. Many were responsible for making this possible: the civil scientists, the radar operators, the radar mechanics who kept the equipment serviceable, and most importantly, the aircrew who finished the job. So, again, I mentioned it was vital they kept secret. They had radar in their aircraft. So, the cavity magnetron didn't go to everybody right away. A, they didn't have enough of them. B, if you're flying over British territory, no problem, because if the plane gets shot down, we recover it. Coastal Command got it. They're flying over the ocean. If they get shot down, plane goes in the water, nobody gets the radar. Bomber Command, flying over enemy territory. That could be a problem. If they shoot one down, they reverse engineer it, now it's useless. So, Bomber Command didn't get it right away. And they needed a backstory to cover the success of their night fighters. So, what they come up with served two purposes. The other part of the story is during the war, there was severe food rationing. People were encouraged to plant a victory garden, grow your own vegetables, grow extras. So this yielded a surplus of carrots. They weren't that popular. So how do we get people to eat these things? Well, you know, if you're coming home from the pub late at night and we're in blackout conditions, if you eat carrots, you'll have good night vision. You'll be able to see where you're going. And the reason our night fighters are so successful is they eat a lot of carrots, and the beta carotene gives them super cat-like night vision.
Carrots?
They even had, yes, carrots. They even had a night ace touring the country promoting carrots, and his call sign was Cat Eyes.
Alright.
So we don't know if the Germans ever bought this, but it's really, yes, carrots are good for your eyes, but they don't give you super night vision.
Yeah.
The Americans picked up on it. Eat carrots and leafy greens and yellow vegetables rich in vitamin A, essential for night sight. So if your mother ever told you to eat your carrots, it's good for your eyes, that's
My
where it
mom
came
says
from.
squash though.
Wash, yeah.
Squash, yeah. Now, I'm gonna come to here. I mentioned Bomber Command didn't get it right away. So they had initially a different system. Up until about mid-42, they used what they called the G and oboe system. Now, G was a navigational system. Basically, they would use known radar station locations in Britain, and they used those signals to triangulate and get a fix on their position. So nearly 3 years of war, it became obvious there was a tremendous need for an accurate bombing system. Despite the earlier development of G, which allowed Allied navigators to get a reasonably close fix on their position, many raids missed their intended targets, resulting in devastating loss of life. Weather, night flying, and inaccurate navigation all contributed to many incidents of misguided bombing on both sides of the conflict. Oboe was used for high-precision bombing missions, particularly in situations where an aircraft's only safe approach was from very high altitude. This accuracy allowed for night and day bombing operations, even in highly fortified areas. Two separate radar stations called Cat and Mouse were used to guide a mosquito bomber to a chosen target. The mosquitoes were called pathfinders. Cat would guide the planes to the target, while Mouse provided a signal to indicate the precise bombing point to drop and time to drop the bombs. For larger bombing runs, mosquitoes dropped flares to mark the target, which provided a clear view for the heavy bombers such as Lancaster to attack the illuminated target. So, good idea in principle. Pathfinder goes in, bombs the target with flares. Lancasters come in, finish the job. Well, Germans figured that out after the Pathfinder went through. And he dropped a lot of flares, made a lot of fireworks, but didn't really do any damage, and then came the bombers. So now the Germans had fake fires. So after the Pathfinder went through, they'd light up these other fires. Now the bomb group's got 5 fires, and they're miles apart. So now they either have to concentrate on one or break up and bomb all of them, which makes them less effective. Oboe played a crucial role in Battle of Normandy operations, where it was used to bomb German-controlled radar stations and artillery sites. Towards the end of the war in Europe, Oboe was used to direct food and supply drops to starving Dutch and occupied Netherlands. The high degree of accuracy minimized the chance that German forces would find the drops and impound them. So that's a whole different story in itself. Operation Manna. And ASV, this is air to surface vessel. This was a U-boat hunter. Radar technology developed airborne radar systems could scan the ocean waves below for submarine activity became a reality. Aircraft to surface vessel radar presented a tremendous challenge. The equipment had to be small and light enough to mount an aircraft without affecting its flying performance. The equipment was heavy, antennas were large, had to be on the outside of the plane. It needed to be fitted with several gyroscopes in order to compensate for the vibration caused by the aircraft engines. Finally, the delicate electronics had to be isolated from the aircraft's ignition system to avoid interference. ASV used very short wavelengths in order to keep the aerials, which were mounted on the outside of the plane, as small as possible, and to improve resolution and accuracy. In its earliest form, Mark I had a wavelength of, surprise, 1.5 meters. And that was believed to be the smallest possible operational radar. The subsequent invention of the cavity magnetron in 1940 allowed wavelengths of only a few centimeters. These narrow, sharp radar beams could target smaller objects without the echo becoming lost and the reflected background noise generated by the wave movements. So these are thousands of little radar reflectors, and you're trying to find this in all that mess. Kind of hard to do. That was my dad's specialty. He was in Bomber Command. So this is all airbrushed for security reasons. There would have been a big antenna under this wing, and it would have looked like an old television antenna. Okay? Would have been one on each side of the fuselage here, and under this wing there would have been a big searchlight called a lee light, and that was like 220 million candle power. So they would pick up a U-boat surface from about 10 miles away, maneuver to come up from behind, and then when they're a mile out, they'd light up the boat with the searchlight, strafe, and try and depth charge it. Success rate was going up. We were catching the U-boats on the surface. However, at 1.5 meters, they weren't too successful because the Germans had already figured that one out. All the U-boats had radar detectors. So if they got scanned, they would dive. By the time the plane got there 10 minutes later, they're long gone. However, with the cavity magnetron, we're now at 9.1 centimeters. They don't work. So now they're catching the boats on the surface. Well, U-boat losses went up dramatically in 1941-42. In fact, the U-boats used to sit out in the middle of the Atlantic because they had what they called the Mid-Atlantic Gap. And what that gap was, that was the gap in the middle of the ocean where they could not get aircraft coverage. They didn't have enough range to get out to the middle and back again. They could only get out about a third of the way and back. So the U-boats would sit out there with impunity and pick off the convoys. Another game changer that happened was the introduction of the B-24 long-range Liberator, which closed the gap. They could now cover convoys from coast to coast. And they had radar in them. U-boat losses, the boats are always going to be around where the convoys are, so the planes patrolled with the convoys. Got so bad for the Germans, they started putting anti-aircraft guns on the U-boats with the order to stand and fight, figuring if they can shoot the plane down, they can get away. Somewhat successful, and it got to the point where the Germans started putting breathing tubes on the U-boats. This was a Dutch invention. When they invaded the Netherlands, they found 4 diesel electrics that they had breathing tubes on. That allowed them to bring fresh air into the engine room while they were submerged at periscope depth. So you could run your diesels underwater indefinitely. So now they started appearing on U-boats. So now we don't have to surface. However, along comes a 3-centimeter radar. And with this, they can see a periscope sticking out of the water, or a snorkel. So now the U-boats have nowhere to hide. And by late 42, 43, all the U-boats have been withdrawn or destroyed. because every time they sent one out, it never came back from patrol. This was a little different too, and I'm not sure at what point this started, but with the magnetron, they had managed also to take television theory and marry it to the radar signal. So now they could display the radar signal as a moving picture on a screen, like a television set. This is why my father knew how to fix televisions when he came back from the war. And just 3 years ago, he said, hey, there weren't any televisions during the war. That was it. Now this was in most of the American aircraft, like the Catalinas, the B-17, B-29, B-24, and it was even in the Canadian-built Lancasters. So this became the workhorse by the end of the war. And this was used for things like what they call blind bombing. Radar could see through cloud cover. Before radar in the aircraft, if the target was cloudy, you weren't allowed to drop your bombs because you're just bombing indiscriminately. So the whole squadron would have to go around and go through the flak again, maybe 2 and 3 times. Now, you can set up and do a radar run on the first pass using blind bombing. Saved a lot of crews. Now, another thing people don't realize is the importance of women. In order to free up men for overseas duty, massive conscription of single women aged 20 and 30 was enacted. And they found themselves assigned to the ranks of the Royal Air Force Radar Direction Finding Division. That was the early name for radar, radio direction finding. They replaced male radar operators who were needed overseas. Members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force completely dominated the English coastal radar stations by 1943. Teams of women took turns working 8-hour shifts, manning the tubes, recording position of planes, deciding the number of Allied air fighters required to intercept the enemy. Desperately needed during air raids, these women bravely remained at their posts, tracking enemy intruders, directing British pilots, while bombs were dropped around them. Those working the cat and mouse stations of the oboe system guided mosquito bombers to their target and instructed them when to drop their loads, while others scanned the skies and seas for low-flying aircraft and U-boats. The little controller where they were sent and often sleeping in homes commandeered by the army or Quonset huts heated by stoves that did not prevent your shoes from freezing to the floor. Female radar operators defended their country for wages that Jan Bates recalls was only enough to get by on and buy shampoo and toothpaste. Other trials including requirements to work swing shifts, as well as being presented with a new technology for which they often received little upfront training. A lack of qualified male instructors meant the WAF operators were often put straight onto duty at a station with no prior experience at all. So the senior women would have to train the junior women, etc., etc. During the war, many WAF operators worked closely together with Canadian radar mechanics. Remember, we made up 50% of the repair guys. As a result, relationships were formed, resulting in many of these women choosing to immigrate to Canada as war brides. At the same time, however, many Canadian women were utilizing similar roles on Canadian radar stations as part of the Canadian Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Specialized training programs set up in Ottawa and other locations to train women as radar operators, similar to those WAF counterparts in Britain. Together, these Canadian British women were tremendous contributors to the radar war. Interesting pictures here. This is a switchboard. The telephone operator, she is in contact with all the airfields. She sends out their orders and they send back their updates. Okay, she's probably one of the key people in this whole system. This is most likely a ground control intercept hut. Everyone's intently watching the screen. She's probably the junior, senior instructor, and he's probably the pilot giving the instructions to the intercepting pilot. This is the plotting room. This is the key to the whole system right here. These are giant maps of their sector. And every plotter has a radar operator working with her. So when she gets a target on her scope, she sends the information to her, she puts it on the map, and as she gets updates on its position, she moves it in real time on the map. They track friendlies as well as enemy aircraft. These two women are watching the battle taking shape on the map, and they're ordering their squadrons into the air. This is the ready board. These are all the squadrons at their disposal, and there's a big clock on the top of this board, and it shows instantaneously what the squadron's state is. So whether on the ground, at the ready, in the air, engaged, returning to base, that is constantly updated. As soon as a fighter squadron is on the ground at the ready, they can be sent back up. So one thing about this system was it was very accurate. And September 15th, 1940 is known as Battle of Britain Day because it was the largest air battle in history, took place over England. Leading up to this, the Germans have been on a campaign of bombing Royal Air Force airfields to try and knock them out of the war. Germany was planning an invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion. Would have been an amphibious operation, but Hitler demanded air superiority because he didn't want them blown out of the water in the English Channel by the RAF. So, had they continued this campaign, they would have been successful. But something happened. Back in the day, probably in August, the commander of Bomber Command, Bomber Harris, decided, you know, we haven't been to Berlin yet. Let's have a go at it just to show them we can do it. Well, Goering had promised Hitler no bombs will ever fall on Berlin. The Luftwaffe will see to that. Well, Berlin just got bombed. Hitler was not a happy camper. So for reprisal, he ordered the destruction of London. I want it gone. I want it gone now. So Goering's got to change tactics. So now he starts a blitz on London. Well, meanwhile, the RAF is busily repairing their airfields, rearming and remanning, and all the German intelligence was showing them that the RAF is down to a handful of fighters because every time we send a raid, they don't send any planes up. So September 15th is going to be the last battle to wipe them out. Well, when they hit the coast, the first wave arrived around dawn, and the RAF was waiting for them. Everywhere they went, they were harassed, going in, coming out. Second wave, same thing. Everywhere we went, there was fighters waiting for us. Third crew heard all these stories. When they hit the coast, they saw the fighters. A lot of them just jettisoned their bombs in the channel and headed back home. Well, what they didn't realize was they're seeing the same planes. That day, most fighter planes flew 4 times. Some of them flew 7 times down in the south. Of course, you're so busy shooting to try to save yourself, you're not writing down the numbers on the tails. So they don't realize they're seeing the same aircraft 2 and 3 times in their trip. Based on this information, oh no, they've got 1,000 aircraft, Hitler postponed the invasion of England. And that day, Winston Churchill decided it would be a good day to pay a surprise visit to Fighter Command headquarters. And he watched the whole thing happening on the plotting tables. And at one point in the battle, he asked the Air Marshal, how many squadrons have we in reserve? And he was told, none. Everything we've got is in the air. Well, what happens if this doesn't work? They're going to stop coming. It'll be in London in 2 weeks. And here we are. Yeah. So this is our version of a plotting table. It's a giant map of southern England here. This is 11th Group Fighter Command Headquarters. This is their huge plotting table. That's where Churchill would have been for September 15th. These are all the officers up here watching what's happening, and they're sending the squadrons up into the air in their sector. This is this might be even be in Canada. We did the same type of thing. This is the Clinton base in the 60s. That's the radome building. It's still there. All the panels have deteriorated, so it's just a metal frame there now. But they were all custom made. Every radar station was the same, so one company made all the panels for them, and they aren't in business anymore. So.
Nobody's maintaining it.
Yeah, well, you can't get those panels anymore. They were custom made. And each one is different. It's not like a whole bunch of them you bolt it together. No, every panel is different. Yeah. So, another infamous lady is Dr. Elizabeth Laird. The time when most women were restricted to the munitions factory or the home, one woman was at the forefront of radar development Canada. Elizabeth Laird was born in Owen Sound, Ontario, and spent most of her youth here in London. Graduated University of Toronto in 1896. Despite being top of her class for 3 years, her graduate school scholarship applications were rejected just because she was female. That's why all the doctors and lawyers were men. They could get scholarship money, women could not. So, while undertaking PhD, so her parents were well off, so they decided their girls were going to get an education anyway, sent them down south. So she was undertaking PhD studies at Pennsylvania's Bryn Mawr College. She was awarded a fellowship to study under the famous physicist Max Planck at the University of Berlin in Germany. So irony here. Actually, Germany was one of the places to be if you were doing any research at all. Same thing with Poland. All the European countries have really, really solid research going on. In fact, the Polish people actually were the first ones to take a crack at decoding the German Enigma machine. They actually constructed one and smuggled it out to Britain before Poland was invaded, like about 2 weeks before they smuggled it out. And it gave the Brits a leg up on actually breaking it. Yeah, if it weren't for the Poles, the Brits wouldn't have broke it. So she found she didn't have any difficulty getting permission from the different professors to attend lectures, and she received her PhD from Bryn Mawr in 1901 for her work on magnetism and spectroscopy, and was hired as an assistant in the science department at Mount Holyoke College. By 1904, promoted to professor and head of the department. Over the next 4 decades, Laird undertook research at such schools as Cambridge, Yale, Universities of Chicago, and Berlin. By the time Laird retired from Mount Holyoke and returned to London in 1940, the world was at war. Hoping to help the war effort, she walked into the physics department at Western and asked if she could be of use. Laird's offer was gratefully accepted. She was made part of a new team of researchers doing intense research on radar development. Throughout the course of the war, she played a key role in studies on antennae radiation patterns, radiation and detection of centimeter wavelength waves, which, gee, that happens to be cavity magnetron. Laird presented several top secret reports on her findings to the National Research Council, which nobody can find, taught Army and Navy personnel, and took her turn monitoring the unheated observation station on the university's campus, and refused pay for any of it. She was made an honorary professor at UWO in 1945. Post-war, she investigated the effects of microwave radiation on biological materials, work supported by the Ontario Cancer Treatment and Research Foundation. By the time she retired for the second time in 1953, she is not only one of Canada's most distinguished physicists, but also the oldest. And she passed away in 1969 at the age of 94. And Western still have a picture of her with her 90th birthday cake.
Nice.
That's nice.
spelled out in Roman numerals. So, being a museum, you sometimes get unsolicited donations. You know, people go, oh, here's some medals, you know, they're my father's or grandfather's. So we got a little box in the mail, and that's what we figured we had until we opened it, and it was this. That is a production model of the 1941 cavity magnetron made by Northern Electric in Canada. That's a picture of the very first prototype.
Oh yeah.
Because it's a single antenna system, you have to switch between transmit and receive real fast. So that's what this little tube on the left side did. Turn the 70 watts or 70,000 watts on and off a million times a second. Great, we're transmitting, can't receive. So that's what this little tube was for. That was the detector oscillator tube. So it would react to the frequency coming back, and then you could amplify it and actually use it. So the way it works is the electrons swirl around in the cavities here, and it makes the cavity resonate. So the frequency it resonates at is about the diameter of the cavity. So in the first magnetron case, it was 9.1 centimeter, which is about 3 gigahertz. And this would have been suspended in a heavy magnetic field, either 2 ring magnets or a horseshoe magnet, like that. That's what makes it work, is the intense magnetic field. These magnetrons came after. This one in the back was used for cancer treatment. That's a medical magnetron. These were defense. This is out of a Pine Tree Line radar station, 3 centimeter. And these two are out of a microwave oven. Well, after the war, Raytheon was one of the prime vendors for radar sets, and they can't give one away. You know, they got surplus planes, surplus radars are being scrapped. Nobody's gonna buy one. So what do? Well, the techs knew, well, you know, if we put our wet gloves in front of the antenna and would dry them out, they get all steamy. And another guy had a chocolate bar melted in his pocket. So with a little research, they come up with the very first commercial microwave oven for the restaurant industry. It was thousands of dollars, weighed hundreds of pounds, but by golly, you could cook a baked potato in 6 minutes. And if you're a steakhouse, that's huge. And then in 1967, they had formed the subsidiary Amana, and they came up with the first consumer microwave oven called the Amana Radar Range. That's the 1970s version of it. I think this is a 73. And it opens down like a conventional oven door. And their drawback was they tended to leak radiation around the door seals. They've since greatly improved that, so it's not a problem now.
Oh, but they do sell still microwaves, this brand.
Yes. Yeah, they still sell Amana.
Yeah, what I find, if you don't mind me interrupting, what I find fascinating about microwaves is that I noticed that sometimes when people are using them to hide classified information, sometimes they'll keep their phone in there because for some reason it kind of blocks a lot of transmission. Like what I
It's a Faraday shield.
Yeah, like what I saw in the movie Snowden, which is a biopic about Edward Snowden and how he was a whistleblower from the CIA and he had his cell phone hidden inside a microwave. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, we that's not that far fetched because what keeps the microwaves inside is the inside is a steel box. So the microwaves bounce off it. They don't penetrate. And the reason you've got a screen in the front, you know, it's got all those little tiny holes. Well, they're at the particular size they are, the microwaves see it as a solid piece. So it's a solid box as far as the microwave is concerned. So it just happily bounces around inside and excites the water molecules in the food. That's called a Faraday shield. You can do the same thing if you had like a steel, like you know the old screens you had, and they were steel mesh.
Yeah.
If you made a cage out of that and had any device inside it, and you grounded the cage, you could not transmit or
Transmit
receive
anything.
with that device because it's totally shielded. In fact, you do the same thing with credit cards. With the tap,
Yeah.
get a circuit board anti-static bag that's metallized. They look silver. Put your credit card in that. It's a Faraday shield, so they can't activate your RF chip.
We should have that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So no, that's how they work. So that probably saved the company. And if you remember the movie Airplane?
Yeah, with
Lloyd
Leslie
Bridges?
Nielsen. Yeah.
And Leslie Nielsen, there's a microwave joke in it.
Yeah.
At one point, the guy yells over, "Check the radar range." The guy goes over to a big radar console, opens a microwave oven on top of it. There's a turkey in there, and he goes, 5 more minutes, and then slams it.
Yeah.
It's a man of radar range.
It's there.
I'm one of the few people that got that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny sometimes when you watch comedies, you have to kind of know like your history or science,
Yeah.
and then you get the
And
joke.
another thing
yeah.
about that movie, there was also another movie in the 50s called Flight into Danger.
Yeah.
And it was a movie about an airline, DC-3 airliner, that both the pilots get food poisoning.
Yeah.
And one of the passengers ends up being the pilot. That was the premise for the movie.
Oh,
Of course,
okay.
a DC-3, you've got the piston engine drone in the background through this whole movie. Well, Airplane, they've got the same DC-3 drone all through the movie, and it's a jet. And it's one of those subtle things that you don't catch.
No, it is.
Yeah.
So, after the Second World War, there was a brief period of relative calm, and then we went right into the Cold War.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Pine Tree Line was the first jointly operated Canadian-American radar line, officially commenced operations in 1951, expanded through the 50s. Pine Tree consisted of 44 stations along the 50th parallel to the east and 53rd to the west. A plan existed as early as 1946 to build Pine Tree, but the Canadian government was not supportive of it until much later. Only the success of the Soviet atomic bomb moved Canada to support the plan, kind of like we do today, reactive rather than proactive. Majority of stations are built in the east because its intention was to protect the industrial heartland and seats of government of both Canada and the U.S. However, as Defense and Strategic Air Command became more important, more radar stations were constructed to fill the gaps in the prairies. When semi-automatic ground environment, also known as SAGE, was introduced in the late 50s and 60s, many Pine Tree Line stations became obsolete. The remaining stations operated until the 80s, and they were shut down as part of the North American Air Defense Modernization Plan. SAGE computer systems significantly reduced the person power required to operate ground control intercept. Information previously given to plotters to depict on tables, as they had during the Second World War, were instead fed to SAGE, which quickly presented it digitally. SAGE allowed for centralization and partial automatic coordination of fighters and other anti-aircraft defense. After that came the Distant Early Warning, or DEW line. In 1952, a summer study group from MIT recommended building a radar network along the 70th parallel. This was accepted by the United States Air Force. The network was named the DEW line, and it became operational in April of '57. DEW line initially ran from Cape Dyer, Canada to Lisburn, Alaska. It was later extended to Greenland and the Aleutian Islands. It consisted of 4 different types of radar stations: unmanned Doppler, gap filler, auxiliary, and main stations. There were 6 mains, 4 in Canada, 2 in Alaska. Although the DEW line was mainly built on Canadian territory, it was almost entirely built and operated under the United States, or by the United States. DEW Q line has been closed since the 80s, but its legacy still remains. The North American Air Defense Modernization Program was initiated. The North Warning System has succeeded its role. Couple of legacies, like they used to just abandon the sites, and then all the fuel oil tanks started leaking, so they had to go up back and remediate them all. The other was what they did to the Inuit people. The government is just recognizing it now. Long time overdue. Mid-Canada. The Mid-Canada line was the third and final Canadian radar line, also known as the McGill Fence. It was designed at McGill University in Montreal, and they did a lot of radar research. Mid-Canada line was first conceived in 1951. It was fully operational by January 1958. Consisted of 8 sector control stations and a number of unmanned Doppler detection stations. Mid-Canada was unique and operated entirely by the Canadian government, whereas the other radars were funded and operated jointly. Its existence was short-lived. However, after 7 years, the Mid-Canada was found to be cost ineffective and decommissioned. So this is a SAGE environment system. That's a light pen. She's marking a target, and that is bringing up all the data they have on that flight, whether it be a commercial flight with a flight plan. If there's nothing on it, then she sends it to tactical to have a look at. That sort of thing. It's obviously a staged photograph. Some Cold War type of items, they're few and far between because it's still under secrecy. They have an 80-year moratorium. Yes, Frank's 85. I don't know if he'll ever be able to talk about it. That's a radar set out of a Voodoo fighter. They have a Voodoo down the street, but they don't have that. The government took it all out. I don't know why, but it might have been more modern. Canada's Cold War. For a long period of political and military tension, mainly between the United States and democratic countries, the Soviet Union, and communist countries, began shortly after the end of the Second World War, and it had an enormous impact on Canada. Radar played a major role in defending the North American continent. Central doctrine of the Cold War was that the theory of deterrence, or that of mutually assured destruction, which a full-scale use of nuclear weapons by 2 or more opposing sides could cause the complete annihilation of both attacker and defender. Many, including government officials, feared nuclear war, which would have had utterly devastating effects on the planet. Thankfully, a nuclear war did not occur, but that didn't stop many different international governments from carrying out hundreds of nuclear tests each. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed by the collapse of the USSR in 1991, marked the end of the Cold War, so we thought. A little different today.
Yeah.
I still remember the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
I was 7. I remember soldiers walking up and down our street in Byron, and they're running the air raid sirens. And they're taking sound level readings. My parents are going out of their minds. Like, Dad, are we going to build a bomb shelter like Ron Sincere's, Dad? No. Why not? We won't need it. I did not know what he meant by that. Yeah. Canada and the United States have a long history of military cooperation, and the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, was a logical step in shared defense responsibility. NORAD, officially founded in 1957, allowed the U.S. and Canada to work jointly for the defense of North America without needing to consult Europe. NORAD's command structure was highly centralized as Soviet airborne threats, first by high-altitude, high-speed aircraft, later by guided missiles, required immediate responses. NORAD operated under the integrated command from NORAD's headquarters in Colorado Springs. The American NORAD commander and the Canadian deputy received information from a variety of sources, including radar chains in Canada. Using this information, the commander and deputy could order both American and Canadian aircraft into action without consulting anyone in Washington or Ottawa. Though the radar lines were decommissioned in the late 20th century, NORAD is still responsible for the defense of North America. And yeah, there were a few close calls in Cuban Missile Crisis. There are 5 levels of defense readiness. DEFCON 5 is everything's hunky-dory, green light. DEFCON 4 is heightened alert. DEFCON 3 is high alert. DEFCON 2, there are planes in the air and they're on station waiting for the signal. DEFCON 1 is nuclear war. We went to DEFCON 2.
Up to 2.
Yeah. And then somebody blinked and it, turns out it was all over testosterone. Americans had some Jupiter missiles that they put into Turkey. Russians didn't know they were obsolete. Americans just put them in there for fun. Of course, Russians demand they be taken out. Americans go, no, we kind of like them in there. So they start building their own in Cuba. Americans go a little crazy about that one. So the standoff was, you start taking them out of Cuba, we'll take them out of Turkey. That was all done through backdoor stuff, but yeah, it was pretty intense. Now this is radar, weather radar. Back in the day, when they introduced the cavity magnetron and they introduced screens where you can display everything, it displays everything, including these big white fluffy things called clouds. The clouds prevent you from seeing the aircraft. So you got 2 groups. You've got the Air Force going, how do we get rid of these things so we can see the airplanes? And the Army Corps of Engineers, they're going, well, time out, maybe we can actually use this to study weather. Remember Robert Watson Watt? Originally, he was a meteorologist. Yes. So the first, and he was trying to track thunderstorms using radio waves. So the first study of weather using radar was actually done in 1943, called the Stormy Weather Project. And that was conducted at Clinton and National Research Council in Ottawa. So, and then from there, they became this Stormy Weather Group, and then in the 50s, the Alberta government asked them to come out to Alberta because they have a huge problem with hail. And if you got a couple minutes, I've got about a 10-minute video on that, but
cool.
some of it repeats a little bit, but I can get it up here in just a second. All right. It's turning out to be nice out there.
Hello, welcome to the Secrets of Radar Museum. I'm Steve Bordeaux. I just did something that millions of Canadians do every day. I checked my weather forecast on a local weather radar on my cell phone. Something we all take for granted. It's part of our daily lives. We do it all the time. But really, how is that possible? In order to answer that, we have to go back to pre-war Great Britain in 1935.
In February of 1935, Robert Watson Watt and his associate Arnold Wilkins devised an experiment using a Handley Page bomber out of Daventry in the UK and BBC signal towers to answer a question. Can radio waves be used to detect aircraft? The answer is a resounding yes. And so, the British Air Ministry gave the green light to Watson Watt to carry out this radar research.
By the beginning of the Second World War, Britain's coast was lined with an ever-expanding network of radar stations capable of detecting aircraft hundreds of kilometers away.
So we're going to start with the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. On one of the schools that was built right near London was Clinton, Ontario. Clinton, Ontario is about an hour north of London, Ontario. So this was a very special school specifically to train radar personnel to go overseas and work radar on, at first, British stations. Why Clinton? So there are 3 reasons why it was chosen. The first one, most famously, is because the area around Lake Huron mimics the cliffs of Dover. At least that's the story. But realistically, it was far from the national border. It was safe from bombing because previously all training was going on in Britain, and they were being bombed by the Germans. It was within transportation hub, so it was easy to get to by train from Toronto, London, and Windsor. And most importantly, it was within a number of other British Commonwealth Air Training Plan stations where flight training was going on, so they could monitor live aircraft on their radar, because it was a radar training school after all. And so there's Centralia, London, and Goderich, where aircraft were flying, and they could sit at their training school where no runway existed and watch all the aircraft come and go. One of the problems that they found at Clinton was that weather interfered with the signals they were getting on their cathode ray tubes. So, in radar, using radio waves, they are sent out, and then they bounce off a target and then are received again at the station or at a different station. And that they can do things like determine height, determine distance, velocity, things like that. But weather has a tendency to get in the way. So what you would see if you had a snowstorm or a rainstorm, or even just a lot of clouds sometimes, was interference on the radar scope, on the cathode ray tube. So a cathode ray tube is the same thing that were in the old televisions. You know, the old televisions that some of us grew up with, that were very heavy and got warm to the touch, and all our cats sat on them. Those had a cathode ray tube in them. And that cathode ray tube was very important to the monitoring of radar. At Clinton, one of the problems was that weather interfered with their tracking of aircraft. They could see precipitation and cloud cover on their live radar screens. Enter Stuart Marshall. In 1943, Stuart Marshall was assigned to Project Stormy Weather. This was a project run by the Canadian Army Operational Research Group. Their job was to make sense of the weather that was playing havoc with their radar screens. So while the Royal Canadian Air Force personnel were working to remove the echoes from the radar, Project Stormy Weather was trying to figure out how to make those echoes useful. Because of the secrecy around radar, we don't actually know if each group knew what the other was doing.
Around 1956, the Stormy Weather Group was contacted by the provincial government of Alberta for help with their hail. Alberta is part of Hailstorm Alley, a geographical hotspot for large hailstorms, where storms commonly produce golf ball-size hail. This kind of violent hail can have devastating consequences for the farmers of Alberta, who in the early 50s had lost several years of crops in a row. These losses were in part what brought Stormy Weather Group to Alberta. They set up a weather array at the Red Deer Industrial Airport and began their observation. Part of the radar used in the study is now located here at the Secrets of Radar Museum in Northern Ontario. This is the feed horn, which creates circularly polarized signals that allow researchers to identify damaging hail in a thunderstorm by its shape. This was unique and the first of its kind in the world, making the Alberta Research Council the world leader in radar hail research. This eventually led to the recent operational deployment of polarization diversity weather radars by Environment and Climate Change Canada, more than 50 years later.
Well, this is a WSR 807 weather radar. This was developed by Environment Canada. They were going to deploy this right across the country. This was the first digital weather radar station.
They could get complex colored weather maps out of it, and they could link them together so they could have a network right across Canada. 4 were built. This is serial number 1. It came to us in 2007 after it became end of life. The other 3, we were not sure what happened to them, but normally the life of surplus government equipment, it goes into a warehouse for several years and then it's sold off at auction when there's determined no use for it. Beginning in mid-1990s, Alberta insurance companies started a hail suppression project, which involved cloud seeding with silver iodide to prevent hailstones from becoming too big and destructive. These initiatives continue today, though results vary, has been largely a successful endeavor. Alberta's hail continues to be an active area of study today and is currently being researched by scientists at Western University under the Northern Hail Project. They continue to further our understanding of atmospheric
This is
phenomena.
2.5 inch.
1978, Stuart Marshall wrote that the activities of the Stormy Weather Project made up
I'm showing her
roughly
this, and she's going through her phone, and she's showing me a picture. This is her neighbor's minivan. After being in a hailstorm, it was like a giant golf ball. It wasn't a spot bigger than that. It didn't have a dent. There were 2 holes in the windshield.
Storm tracking in
But
Alberta, weather radar has
they
come
try
a
to
long
study it and
way
make it
from
like
its origins
smaller.
Yes.
nearly 90 years ago. Incidentally, Robert Watson Watt began his career as a meteorologist, pioneering the use of radio waves to track thunderstorms and other atmospheric phenomena. Work that is proudly and enthusiastically carried out by Canadian meteorologists today. Do you know that every Canadian can take part in weather research? Western University's Northern Tornado Project and the Northern Hail Project would like to hear from you if you experience severe weather conditions. Please see the information on the screen. Thank you for watching, and keep your eyes on the weather.
I didn't know hail was bad in Alberta. I didn't know.
Yeah,
It's really. Well, I
yeah,
haven't
no,
been
they,
there.
they can get up to softball size. And the problem with those is they don't show up on radar. Like if you've got hail and it's like this, there's a lot of it and it's close together, so you get what they call a bright band. So that shows up on radar, but when they're this, okay, that's a small bird. Most radars are detuned, they're not going to see that. So what they do is they take the variable polarization and they actually 3D map the cloud, and then they can say, okay, typically clouds of this shape produce these size hailstorms. So by doing enough studies, they can predict with confidence this one will produce large hail. We don't know how big. So then the other study was, how do we mitigate? So now I believe back in the day, I don't know if they're using the same method, but they used to fly through the cloud with an airplane and seed it with silver iodide.
Oh, they already.
And that would make the water droplets form more quickly and drop out. And you'd either have small hail or rain.
It's like cloud seeding.
Yeah, exactly what it is, cloud seeding. Yeah. And that's basically how it got started.
It only happens in Alberta, like those kinds of.
Because of the
things.
Rocky Mountains, yeah, all down the Rockies there, down into the States, you'd have the same thing on the east side of the Rockies, because most of the prevailing winds are from the west. So when they come down the mountain, they're dry, they pick up moisture, and it's heating. So as the day gets hotter, the updrafts, so you got cold air coming down, getting heated, picking up moisture, going up, forming rain, going back down and going back up. So it's constantly cycling, and then it starts freezing when it gets up here. And then the hail gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the stronger the updrafts, the larger the hail will get before it's too big and it comes down.
It's interesting. I never knew that.
And that other thing, there's an inside joke there, that picture of Santa.
Yeah.
Well, turns out back in 1955, Sears in Colorado Springs put an ad in the local newspaper and it said, "Hey kids, you can call Santa Claus on his private number Christmas Eve." And they published this number, which was wrong. You know, they had a hotline set up for people to answer, but nobody's calling because the number in the paper was wrong. Who they were calling, it was the direct line to the commander of NORAD. So Christmas Eve, the phones are ringing off the wall, and somebody must have figured out what had happened and showed it in the newspaper. So the commander gets on the phone to the radio station, identifies himself as the commander of NORAD, and NORAD was currently tracking and guiding Santa on his flight that evening. And it's something they still do today. December 1, NORAD Track Santa website comes up live, and they got all kinds of kids.
I remember seeing it on the news a lot of times around
Yeah.
Christmas. Yeah.
Yeah, and they assign 2 RCAF pilots to escort Santa through Canadian airspace. And I think the Americans have 2 fighter pilots that, you know, because we don't cross the borders. So that was an interesting tradition that got started by a fluke.
That's fun.
So that's basically us in a nutshell. We've got a collection of vacuum tubes of different sizes and functions, et cetera, et cetera. Have to be a real nerd to love them, but they are significant to our story and history. So basically, everything I'm holding here was developed in the 40s.
Yeah. That's true.
In fact, the G box over there, that is the first plug-and-play electronics. Because the black box, it was called a black box, and that was actually the first aircraft black box, was the frequency deck. So if you pulled that out, put a different one in, you change the frequency of the aircraft. So to change the whole squadron, the ground guys would go around with a whole bunch of these, swap them out. Now your squadron's on a new frequency.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Yeah,
That's
so
how
that was the first black
so
box.
that's the black box of planes.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the tour.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah, and be sure to like and subscribe to my channel, Tom Friel.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot, guys.
yeah, no worries.
Come on down. We're open. It doesn't cost anything to come in, but we do like to have a donation. So
Sure thing.
that's how we survive. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.